Hey everyone, welcome back. This is the second video. We're now talking about moral realism. So moral realism is the view that moral rules or moral facts are objective and universal truths that apply to everybody. So moral truths on this picture are a lot like mathematical truths. They're sort of built into the universe. They're objectively true. If you think that 6 plus 5 equals 100, that's not a different opinion than everyone else has. That's a fact that you're wrong about. You are mistaken about what 6 plus 5 equals. And that's fine. We all accept that math is not a matter of opinion. What the derivative of a function is not a matter of opinion. There's a real fact there that you are right or wrong about. And the moral realist thinks that moral truths are a lot like that. So mathematical truths are real and objective, but you can't find out about them by like going out and looking in the world. If you want to know, for example, what the square root of 2 is equal to, you can't go find the square root of 2 and measure that thing. That's not really how it works. It's just you have to figure it out on pen and paper. You have to think through it logically. And that's how we find out new mathematical truths. With pen and paper, mathematicians prove stuff. They make logical, valid arguments showing that some mathematical fact is true. And that, the moral realist thinks, is a lot like how morality works. You can't go out and measure morality. You can't build a device that will measure the rightness or wrongness of something. But if you sit and you think through things and you form valid arguments, you will find out what the moral truths are. So you might, if you're a Kantian, you might think that once we sit down and figure out the moral truths, they will tell us that there is a categorical imperative that we all must follow in all cases. If you are a utilitarian, you might think that once we sit down and think through morality with valid arguments, we'll see that happiness is the only inherent good. And so maximizing happiness in all cases is what we ought to do. And that is a real objective fact. So the moral realist thinks that morality is a real objective fact about the world. It's just there for us to discover, sort of the way we discover mathematical truths. So that means moral truths are not matters of opinion, and they're not relative to a society. Morality is not up to us in any sense of the phrase "up to us." It's not a matter of opinion. Societies don't get to decide what's right or wrong. If one society thinks that stealing bread to feed your family is okay, and another society thinks that it's not okay, one of those societies is just wrong on the moral realist picture. It's not a cultural difference. It's a real factual disagreement. So the moral realist thinks that there just are no differences of opinion when it comes to morality. Every claim about morality, whether it's lying is always wrong, or what Nixon did during Watergate was immoral, or sitting down in a chair is morally acceptable in some cases, like whatever it might be, there's a fact there that is you can either get right or get wrong. If you make a moral claim, a moral statement, you are either factually correct or factually incorrect on the moral realist picture. And so moral truths apply to everyone regardless of their opinion, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of the time or the place or the culture or the society that they grew up in. Moral truths apply to everybody equally. And so there's no difference in morality between people or between cultures or between times and places. There's just differences in belief about morality, just like there is in science. There was a time where people thought that the sun revolved around the earth. We now know the earth revolves around the sun. There is a difference in belief about sun and earth rotation or evolution between the past and now. But we know the past was wrong and the present we're right. They were incorrect about which revolved around the other, and we are now correct. So morality on the moral realist picture works like that. People had different moral systems in the past, but those were just wrong on the moral realist picture. Past societies accepted all sorts of, violence and bigotry that we know are just not morally okay. If you're a moral realist, then those sort of different moral beliefs in the past are just factually incorrect. And anyone who still believes them now, no matter where they are, even if they are in a society where that's the majority view, those people are just incorrect about what's morally right and morally wrong. And so moral realism is common among ethicists and philosophers in general. But it does have some problems. So a lot of people sort of start out moral realist. In life, you think, no, clearly murder is wrong. What the Nazis did was wrong. Anyone who says it's not is incorrect. Those things really are wrong. And if you think that, then you're a moral realist. And so a lot of people start out moral realist. But there are some problems for moral realism. And we're going to talk about the potential problems for all of these views. So one of the potential problems for moral realism is that it makes moral rules seem weird. They're like these magic rules in the sky that are somehow part of the universe, but are seemingly unlike every other aspect of the universe. So moral rules or moral facts aren't physical things. Like you can't go out and touch moral rules the way you can go out and touch plants and salamanders and the stuff that, biologists study. You can't measure the value, the moral value of an action the way you can measure momentum or the brightness of a star or something in physics. It's very different than everything else that exists in the world. So on the moral realist picture, actions just have this sort of intrinsic value to them. They are morally good and have positive value, or they're morally bad and they have negative value. And they have this value completely independent of our judgments about them. So they have this value independent of how we as humans evaluate them. We might value it very highly and be wrong to value it highly. It may have a really low value, objectively speaking. It may be really bad, even if we think it's really good. And so if there are these objective moral truths built into the universe, then they're really different than everything else in the universe. And some people think that's just weird. It's weird to say that there are these sort of magic rules that just exist and we discover them somehow and we are right or wrong about them. And some people might think that, religion and God can give an answer here, but most philosophers are convinced by Plato's Euthyphro that doesn't solve the problem. There is still a problem here. If you are curious about that, let me know and I'll send you something to read. But so this is a problem. No matter what your sort of religious views are, if you want to be a moral realist, you have to explain how there are these sort of values, because there's a pretty solid argument that the values have to be independent, even of any god or gods. The values have to be independent of God. So even God valuing things won't answer this question. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed. What are they? They are very different things than everything else in the world. If there are these real moral facts, moral rules, and moral values just in the world. But that's just one problem. Another problem is how we come to know moral truths. How do we find out what these moral truths are? Because they're part of the world. But we said they're weird parts of the world. So you can't go out and measure them. You can't go out and poke them. Moral rules and moral values aren't something you can find out about empirically. You can't go out and test and discover the moral truths the way we go out and discover truths about chemistry and biology and physics and things like that. So David Hume was a Scottish philosopher from the 1700s who called this the is-ought problem. He said, you can't see what is the case in the world. You can't look at what does happen and figure out what ought to happen, what ought to be the case, what should happen. Because morality is really about what we should or shouldn't do, what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. So if we look at the world sort of empirically, we will see what is the case. We will see what people actually do. But just looking at what happens can't tell us what people ought to do, what people should do, whether or not what they're doing is good. That's something else. That's something sort of over and above, sort of separate from the empirical facts of what's actually happening. Morality is supposed to be about not what actually happens, but what should happen, what ought to happen. And looking at what does happen doesn't directly tell us what ought to happen. So it's not really clear how we explain, how we find out. How do we find out what ought to happen? Because it can't be empirical. It can't be looking at the world and sort of seeing what happens and just recognizing value because it's measurable or empirical or something. It's what ought to be the case is a separate question from what actually happens. So empirical means of going out and looking at the world can't tell us the moral truths. So then how do we know what the moral truths are? How do we know which moral claims are true? A lot of us might sort of be inclined to say, well, I was taught morality by parents, teachers, grandparents, mentors, whatever, etc. But those people who taught you the right way to act and what you should and shouldn't do, told you to share and not to steal and that kind of stuff, they were taught morality by someone at some point. But eventually that chain of teaching has to end. Somewhere the chain of teaching has to end. Someone had to find out. Like, probably some basic science information. Some basic physics or chemistry or biology because you took a class on that at some point. And your teacher was taught that information by someone else who was taught that information by someone else and so on in this chain of teaching. But we know where that chain ends. It ends with a scientist somewhere in the past measuring something and testing a theory and coming up with a theory and getting evidence that that theory is right. We know where that chain ends. We know where we as a species acquire scientific knowledge from, but it's not clear where we as a species acquire moral knowledge from. How we find out which moral claims are true in the first place seems a little trickier than how we find out about scientific or mathematical truths. So it looks like you might have to propose some kind of special moral faculty, some special power in our minds to find and recognize moral truths. But it's not clear how that would work. And it looks sort of magical that you just sort of luckily can intuitively recognize these facts of the world that are real objective facts out there that you can intuitively feel and see and recognize without actually seeing or feeling or touching anything with any of your physical senses. That's weird. There's not a lot else that we know by that sort of means. It's not clear how we would have that moral faculty. It's certainly not clear how evolution would explain that sort of thing. And so that seems like a significant problem for moral realism. Moral realism needs to give an answer for what these moral truths are and how we come to find out about them. And it's not clear how to do that. There are lots of attempts to do it, but there's no, as far as I know, there's no sort of consensus about what the right answer is here. And so that's sort of two potential problems for moral realism. It lets us say things that we want to say, like that what the Nazis did really was wrong, and anyone who supports what they did is wrong. Like, that's, moral realists get to say that. And as we'll see, not all of these theories get to say that sort of thing, even though that seems like it is a correct thing to say. So there's a lot that looks good here in moral realism, but there are some potential problems that need to be overcome. And so that's moral realism in a nutshell. What the theory says, some potential problems for it. If you have any questions about moral realism, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video where we will be talking about moral relativism.